Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Session 2, Day 3 of the Department of Education, Program Integrity, and Institutional Quality Committee Regulatory Negotiations. As usual, we will start off this morning with a roll call from our committee members. We will start with our non-federal negotiators, beginning with our business officers from institutions of higher education. Joe Weglars.
Good morning.
Good morning. And alternate Dom Chase.
Present.
Good morning. Our civil rights organizations and consumer advocates, we have Carolyn Fast as primary.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Maheen Sanchez. Oh, all right. We didn't quite hear you, Maheen, but I think we'll work on your audio later, make sure that's working. For our financial aid administrators, Joellen Price.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Zach Goodwin.
Morning.
Good morning. Representing historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and minority-serving institutions, institutions of higher education eligible to receive federal assistance under Title III, Parts A and F, and Title V of the HEA. We have Charles B.W. Prince, DC. All right, DC is not in yet. D'Angelo Sands. All right, don't see D'Angelo yet either. For our institutional accrediting agencies recognized by the Secretary, Jamie Studley.
Good morning. Hello.
Good morning. And Michael McComas.
Good morning.
Good morning. Our legal assistance organizations, Robin Smith.
Good morning.
Good morning, Robin. And Sophie Lane.
Good morning.
Good morning. For our private nonprofit institutions of higher education, we have Erica Linden.
I'm here, thank you.
Good morning. And Scott Dolan.
Good morning.
Good morning. For our programmatic accrediting agencies recognized by the Secretary, to include state agencies recognized for the approval of nurse education, Laura Racer King.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Amy Ackerson.
Good morning.
Good morning. For our proprietary institutions of higher education, we have Jillian Klein.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Alyssa Dobson.
You mean David Cohen?
I think,
Thought I saw her.
yeah, I'm here, but I'm from four-year public institutions.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. Yes.
Good morning.
For proprietary institution of higher education, it's David Cohen. My apologies.
No problem. Good morning.
Good morning, David. Now for public four-year institutions of higher education, Jason Lorgan.
Good morning.
And again, Alyssa, good morning. For our public two-year institutions of higher education, Joe Alice Blondin.
Hello.
Good morning. And Michael Sealsey.
Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday. For our state attorneys general, Diana Hooley.
Good morning.
And the alternate position is not filled. For state officials, including state higher education executive officers, state authorizing agencies, and state regulators of institutions of higher education, we have John Ware.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Rob Anderson.
Rob's not here today. He had a family issue.
Okay, thank you. For students or borrowers, including currently enrolled borrowers or groups representing them, we have Jessica Morales. Jesse? Okay, I don't see her just yet. I think she will be joining us shortly. And Emmett Blaney.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh yes, okay, Jesse. Okay.
I'm here.
Good morning.
And Emmett won't be here today.
Okay,
I'm still
Emmett
trying to
won't
figure out
be.
the camera, and I'm working on renaming, but I have internet today, so right now we're at a win.
All right, that is, we are winning. And finally, we have U.S. military service members, veterans, or groups representing them. Barmac Nasirian. Oh, good morning, Barmac. And Ashlyn Haycock Loman.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. For the department today, we have our federal negotiator is Greg Martin. Greg, if you just want to say good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. And we do know that leading our discussion today of R2T4 is Dave Musser from the department. Good morning, Dave. And from the department's Office of General Counsel, we'll have Denise Morelli.
Hi, all.
Good morning, Denise. And Donna Mango. Is Donna here?
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay. Before I turn it over to Dave for to get us started with R2T4, we do have just two quick announcements. First, we are halfway through, so congratulations, everyone. We do want to just be mindful that we do have American Sign Language interpreters actively interpreting us. So if we can be mindful of that with our speaking pace. And also, since we are halfway through, time is of the essence. So remember a few things to please keep your comments concise, germane to the issue at hand, offering new ideas, and if we could try to refrain from piggybacking. And remember that there are multiple ways in which we can share information with the rest of the committee members and the department, including in the chat box and through proposals and information sharing through email. All right. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dave Musser. Dave.
All right. Thanks, Crystal. So this morning, I think we'll dive right on in to return of Title IV funds, if everyone is prepared to do that. And I think to get started, we will throw the issue paper up so for everyone to review it. And I'll go through each issue, including the ones for which no changes have been made, just to make sure that everyone remembers what the department's intent was and what we were doing with each of the items. So we'll start out with the change to 34 CFR 668.21, in which we amended the requirements for cases where a school dispersed direct loan funds to a student in excess of the charges for the institution, and the student did not attend for the period that the disbursement was made for. Previously, the requirement was that we would the school would provide information to the servicer, and the servicer would issue a final demand letter to the student, essentially requiring the student to repay the entire amount. And this change would alter that to have the student repay the loan under the terms of the master promissory note that the student had signed. So I'll pause there and see if anyone has first any comments on this. We have not made any changes to this provision.
Okay. Seeing none, I think we're free to move on, Dave.
Okay, well, actually, I think I'd like to take temperature checks on each of these items as we go through, just to have a sense of where everyone stands on each item. So if we could take a temperature check on this one. Absolutely.
All right, and just as a reminder of how our temperature checks work, thumbs up if you are in favor of the language as proposed. If you maybe have a few reservations, but you can still live with it, we're going to be a sideways thumb. And if you disagree with it and you know would like to mark that, we would go thumbs down. So let's see a show of thumbs if we can. Okay, all right. I think we see yours, Jesse. I am marking that there are no thumbs down, so thank you for that.
All right, thanks everybody. I think then we'll move on to the next item. Thank you, Vanessa. And this is beginning the section on exemptions to a student being treated as withdrawn and therefore subject to the return of Title IV funds requirements. You can scroll down a little bit, Vanessa. So if everyone recalls, previously the department had proposed to strike the exemption for students that complete a module or a combination of modules that comprise at least 49% of the payment period for which the student received Title IV funds. We heard some feedback that there were cases where this could significantly disadvantage students who only take a few courses, especially in summer terms, where it's actually quite frequent that a student might take only one course in one module and another course in another module, in which case the other exemption for completing modules within a payment period would not apply. And that, of course, is the exemption for completing at least half-time coursework in a payment period. So hearing the concerns posed by institutions and others, the department has replaced the original language in this section that would provide that an exemption exists if a student completes a module or a combination of modules that comprise at least 49% of the payment period or period of enrollment. And I will pause there for comment from the committee.
Now we're waiting on comments. I do just want to note that the alternates for the HBCUs, HSIs, and TCUs, D'Angelo Sands has stepped in for the primary. And Jillian.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank the department for hearing the comments from the committee in January and reverting back to this language. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Julian. And I guess I should make one more comment. We did receive a proposal. I think it was intended to help assuage the department's concerns about the burden associated with this calculation. The proposal was for us to make this optional, and we determined that we don't have the legal authority to do that. It's essentially an all or nothing proposition. Either we consider the student to be withdrawn in these circumstances or we do not. And so we have gone and simply replaced the provision. All right, in that case, we'll take a quick temperature check on this one.
Okay. For 668.22A2 Romanet 2A2, let's see thumbs on that. It looks like we have no thumbs down for, Jamie, I'm sorry. Okay, no thumbs down for that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. And then I think we can move on to the next item, which is the second exemption that the department had proposed altering. And if everyone recalls, in this instance, the department has proposed to exempt from consideration as a withdrawal and therefore the return of Title IV requirements, a student who, although they may have been in attendance on campus, the institution treats the student as if they never attended. The institution returns all of the student's Title IV funds. The institution refunds all institutional charges to the student. If you can scroll down a little bit. And the institution writes off or cancels any current year balance owed by the student to the institution due to the institution's returning of Title IV funds to the department. So this was an interesting topic of discussion last time. What we heard was general support for the provision with some concerns proposed by schools who acknowledged that there were services and goods and other items that a student might purchase from the institution, including room and board, that the student did make use of for a period while the student was in attendance. And some of those negotiators proposed that we allow schools to leave some of those charges on a student's account and still qualify for this exemption. However, the department's position is that the exemption is intended to treat the student as if they truly never attended and never had any costs for the period. And for that reason, we believe that writing off or canceling any balance owed from those charges is important. And we don't believe that we can make exceptions to that and still consider the student to not have withdrawn. In those circumstances, we believe it's more appropriate to treat the student as a withdrawal and simply have the school complete the RTT4 calculation for the student, and which would result in at least a small amount of Title IV funds, typically the student remaining eligible for. But now I will pause there and open it up to the committee for discussion on this point.
Jason?
Thank you. So I just have a question or a clarification around this. So the revised text indicates when a student is not considered to have withdrawn, but if the text is passed, then would those institutional debts paid by loans now be refunded to the student? This seems like it could be an unintended consequence of the changes in both sections. Thank you.
So this is a circumstance where the student is treated as a non-attender, and the student received loan funds, and because they're treated as a non-attender, they would therefore simply repay the loan as part of the MPN. Is that the question? Got it.
He's nodding his head.
So in these circumstances, and I'll make sure and turn to my department colleagues to make sure that they agree with me. But I believe our intent was that the institution would return all of the student Title IV funds for the period, including amounts that the student received in excess of institutional charges, such that there would be no loan funds remaining that the student had incurred as debt for the period in question. So the provisions of 668.21 that we referred to earlier would not apply in these circumstances because there would be no loan funds that fell into the category of remaining debt that the student was then responsible for.
Any other comments on this section before we do a temperature check? Okay, seeing none, let's do a see thumbs for 668.22A to Romanet 2, A6, 7 with strike through. All right. Yeah. I am Jamie. Okay. Looks like there are no thumbs down for that one. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, everyone. And then I think we can move down to the final exemption under discussion. So could we scroll up a little bit, Vanessa? First to talk through what we had previously proposed. The department had originally proposed to not consider a confined or incarcerated individual to have withdrawn in certain circumstances where the student was forced to cease attendance for reasons outside the student's control. What we heard from the committee was that there were some concerns with that proposal for several different reasons, one of which being that some institutions already have established generous refund policies that incorporate the concept of R2T4, meaning that they make students whole in these circumstances with the understanding that students are not likely to be able to repay amounts that get returned or work through institutional debts that result from the R2T4 process. We also evaluated this from a legal perspective, and ultimately we determined that we don't believe that we have the ability to fully consider a student who have not withdrawn if they have begun attendance and none of the other exclusions apply. For that reason, we have struck the original proposed language here. But we have introduced another set of changes that we hope will at least that will address some of our concerns about these situations. So Vanessa, if you could scroll down just a little bit here. So we are proposing a new condition under the leave of absence regulations under 34 CFR 668.22D that are targeted at confined or incarcerated individuals. And that this is essentially intended to allow these individuals to return to their coursework in a more flexible way, if they, especially if they experience one of these instances where they are unable to complete their coursework due to circumstances outside their control. So if you scroll down to the language that we've introduced here, this is under 668.22D. Approved leave of absences allow an institution to temporarily place essentially the student, the way I think of it is, in a holding pattern if they meet certain criteria. Generally, it requires that the student submit a request to be placed on the leave of absence in accordance with specific policies that the institution has established, although in certain circumstances, if there is an emergency, the student can be placed on a leave of absence after the fact, as long as the school has adequate documentation of the circumstance. However, in term-based programs, there are some very strict limitations on when this can be used. Typically, you don't see leaves of absence in term-based programs because they're of the requirement that you see here under D1 Romanet 7, which is that the only way that you can allow a student to go on a leave of absence currently in a term-based program that does not include a subscription-based program is if upon the student's return, they are permitted to complete the coursework that they began prior to the leave of absence. In the vast majority of cases, students who are in term-based programs, if they withdraw from all their coursework and they simply return in a new term, generally starting new classes. There are exceptions. There are cases where schools are able to make that work, but it's our belief and understanding that it's quite rare. So we have, in this iteration of our proposal, we have added another exclusion to this limitation to say that if a student is in an eligible prison education program, the school has more flexibility, including in term-based programs, to allow the student to return to coursework that starts later on without necessarily completing the coursework that they began prior to the leave of absence. This would allow the school to, for a period of time, allow the student to be out for whatever reason. It could be because the facility in which they are incarcerated has locked down. There could be other medical reasons the student is out. But in any event, as long as the student is able to return to coursework within 180 days, which is the time limit for leaves of absence overall, the student could resume without being treated as a withdrawal in these circumstances. So let me pause there and see if there are questions or comments from the committee before we talk through it.
Looks like we're good on that one, Dave.
Okay, seeing no other comments or questions, we'll take a temperature check on this new language.
Okay. So let's see our temperature check for 668.22D. You can see thumbs. Okay, just one, Jamie. Jamie? I don't know.
Looks like her internet might be out. I'll reach out to her.
Okay. But outside of that, there are no thumbs down for that.
Okay.
Thank you. And she looks like she's good too. All right.
All right. In that case, I will move on to the next item. As a reminder, this was the proposal that the department made last time. We did not make any changes to this one. In this one, we specified that in cases where a student has entered a second or subsequent payment period in a clock hour program, sorry, let me go back. That's the wrong provision. In this one, we are codifying a longstanding policy that if a student withdraws from a program that is required to take attendance, they must, within 14 days of the last date of attendance, document a student's withdrawal date. And essentially that means that the clock starts for the return deadlines for that student no later than 14 days after the student's last date of attendance. And I'll pause there again and ask if there's any discussion on this point.
Okay.
Another... Oh, Zach has questions.
Oh, okay.
I see it in the chat.
All right, so Zach Goodwin is coming in.
It was actually about the next item. So I will go off camera for a minute.
Okay. Hearing no questions or comments, we will take a temperature check for 668.22B2. We can see thumbs for that. And Joe Weglars. Okay. We have counted for all the thumbs, no thumbs down. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, Vanessa, I think we can move on to the next item. In this section, we are dealing with the withdrawal date for a student who withdraws from an institution that is required to take attendance. Originally, as you guys recall, the department proposed here to require attendance taking for students who were enrolled in distance education coursework. However, the draft language referred to a program offered through distance education. We heard from the committee that there were some concerns with that drafting, and especially that it suggested that enrollment in even one course or even any distance education could cause an entire program to be treated as distance education. That was not the department's intent. So we did revise the language here to refer to a distance education course. However, I want to remind the group of our discussion yesterday. We were considering adding a definition of a distance education course. And if we do so, I think that would also be the term that we used here rather than a course offered entirely through distance education. For consistency's sake, we would use the term that is established elsewhere in the regulations that would apply more broadly for this purpose. We did receive a proposal that certain kinds of programs be exempt from this requirement. However, it is the department's view that distance education generally should be subject to this provision for the reasons that we previously described. We believe that such programs generally have a better ability to record course assignments as well as interactions between students and instructors, which are part of the requirement for regular and substantive interaction in distance education programs. That's the criteria that separates them from correspondence courses. And therefore, we have not made any changes to the types of programs that are subject to this. It would be any course offered through distance education. And I'll pause there and ask for discussion from the negotiators.
All right, before I take Julian, Zach Goodwin is coming in for the financial aid administrators. Jillian.
Thanks. I'll get Vidi separately on types of programs, but I think we had this conversation in January, and I part of what I submitted in a proposal is trying to fix what I think is still clunky language. So I don't know if you want to bring the proposal back or the language back up, or you don't have to, I guess, but the way this still reads to me is that if an institution offers one course via distance education, the entire institution is required to take attendance. And I thought we talked about this in January, and I thought the department said that wasn't the intention, but the language still says that. So I guess I'm struggling. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what the department is intending here, but that feels different than the conversation we had in January.
That's understandable. So on this point, if you look at the language for the other provisions, they all say the same thing, which probably is also confusing based on kind of the way that it reads. But the department's historical interpretation has been that this applies on a much more granular level and not to the institution as a whole. So for example, if you look at B3 Romanet 1B, the institution itself has a requirement that its instructors take attendance. That would apply only in cases where, for example, in a particular program, the institution required its instructors to take attendance. But if it did not require its instructors to take attendance in other programs, the department would not apply the attendance taking requirement to those other programs. So we mirrored the language that exists elsewhere in this provision for this, and we would apply the exact same approach, which is to say that This only applies in cases where the student is taking a course through distance education. And I want to pause for a second and also return to a discussion that we had last time about how this would be done in cases where a student is taking some courses through distance education and some that are not through distance education. In a payment period or a period of enrollment where the student is taking both distance education courses and courses that are not offered through distance education and do not otherwise have attendance taking requirements, that student is treated as a non-attendance, is not required to take attendance for that period because the presence of one course for which the school is required to take attendance does not give assurance that the attendance is accurate for the student for the entire period if there are other courses that the student is taking for which attendance is not required. So this really only applies in cases where the student is enrolled in all distance education courses for a particular payment period or period of enrollment, or in cases where the student is enrolled in a combination of classes that are distance education or where one of these other attendance taking requirements apply.
So I hear what you're saying, but with all due respect, I think current A, B, and C actually do speak at an institution level. And so this actually feels like an outlier to me in terms of the construction. But I guess, putting that aside, I guess if you guys are already making changes to this language, why wouldn't you just change an institution is required to take attendance to actually reflect what the department's intention is, as opposed to saying, we'll have this language and then give guidance that it actually doesn't mean what it said. I guess I would just suggest clarity because I think it reads really clunky. And Dave, I trust you and you're sitting here and telling us your expectation for institutions, but I don't know that the guy after Dave is going to feel the same way. So I guess respectfully, I would just say, I think it would make more sense if you would actually just edit the language to say what it is you're saying right now.
We can consider that, and I acknowledge that the language has been interpreted over time in a way that does seem different from the drafting of it. And you can find those things in our preamble discussions of the other provisions throughout time. But I do acknowledge that it might be a good idea to amend the actual technical language here. We were frankly hoping not to introduce too many additional changes, which were where we could make other mistakes. But we will look at it from a legal perspective and decide whether it's worth doing that. And I appreciate the suggestion.
Yeah, thanks. I would just urge the department to avoid regulating via preamble if possible. Thanks.
Thank you. Zach.
I think in light of some of the discussion with Jillian, but now my question may have changed slightly. I think I have heard over the course of the years, because the department has tended to be very flexible about how we interpret required to take attendance for students. A school could require it across the board. It could require it for certain programs, certain courses, for a certain part of the payment period even. And there has been, at least in my interpretation, some flexibility around if a professor of their own volition, let's say, chooses to take attendance, that we're considering that course perhaps as a required to take attendance type of course. And we could then rely on those attendance records for determining a withdrawal date. Not that we were necessarily required to do that, but that was still something we could do. Is that, given the debate here between required to take attendance and cases where attendance may be taken but not required to be taken?
Yeah.
Could we still, for this online course, rely on those attendance records in the absence of other information?
Yes. So that's a great question, Zach. There's a separate provision that permits an institution to refer back to its records, its attendance records for the student. And even in cases where the student might be enrolled in some courses that are attendance taking and other courses that aren't, the school can use its best judgment to use the attendance records that it can find for that student. And I'll give an example of how that would probably play out here. You would have, for your distance education course, you would have attendance records, presumably that are accurate, since if the school is complying with this, were this to become regulation. But you would also probably go back to the other non-attendance taking classes and ask the instructor for whatever records they could provide. and then you would use the record for the last date, the furthest into the payment period that you could determine that the student attended based on the combination of all those records. Now that student for that period is not considered to be at an institution required to take attendance. So you're not required to use those records, but a lot of schools do. A lot of schools choose to give the most accurate representation of the student's attendance for the period out of a sense of fairness and accuracy. So that would still be fine here.
Okay, thank you. I more wanted to be sure that that option was retained.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to note that Scott Dolan is coming in for the private nonprofit institutions. Jason?
Thank you. Thank you. So I just wanted to provide a little more context about what I think is unclear about the language. So financial aid is not my subject matter expertise, so I consulted with the 10 financial aid directors in the UC system and also the UC system headquarters. And everyone agreed that they believe that the way the regulations are currently written includes the entire institution versus an individual course. So I realized that you just said that it does not, but I wanted to, reiterate that I really do think that it's perceived that it's the entire institution the way it's written. Thank you.
That's good to know. Actually, I think that gives some additional support to Jillian's suggestion that the department amend this language to be more specific about what we intend here. And I think we're willing to go back and take a look at that.
Scott?
Yeah, I guess just given that the context for the changes was around simplicity, I think some of the conversation we're having here maybe might beg the question about whether or not how it's written is making things simpler for institutions, especially if it's going to be left open to interpretation. And I know some of the constituents within our group have raised some concerns around, what this would look like in practice, where an institution might use multiple learning management systems and have different components of this, right? So having those speak to their financial aid systems and address it. And I hear the openness to flexibility of interpretation, and but I think have some concerns about whether or not it's really, as stated, helping the department meet its intent. If the intent is really just about simplifying the process and not something else, right? Because there were some conversations earlier in the first session about potential non-compliance, but there were some at least brief discussions about where that might have occurred, but not a whole lot of data and evidence to support the non-compliance side of piece. So that would just be another suggestion. If it's more than simplicity, to maybe provide a bit more of a rationale and justification for moving in this direction, given the fact that it will, at some institutions, become more complicated to implement.
Understood. Thanks, Scott. I do want to make a note from our original discussion that the department's intent here is both to improve the clarity of the regulations and the simplicity of the requirement, but also to improve the accuracy of return on Title IV calculations. Part of the simplicity piece of this is that the guidance that the department has previously published on whether an institution is required to take attendance for distance education coursework is actually focused on 668.22b, 3 Romanet 1b. And actually, maybe, Vanessa, if you could quickly bring up the language just so everyone can see that item. I want to make sure I explain the context here so that everyone understands. I don't know if Vanessa is able to. Oh, there she is. So B is the requirement that if the institution itself has a requirement that its instructors take attendance, they are considered an attendance-taking institution. So as I mentioned, the department has interpreted that at a much more granular level than it seems to read here. And in guidance, we specified that there were cases where if an institution was recording a student's activities in a particular course, and those activities rose to the level of academic engagement, meaning that they were not merely logins, but they were more substantive activities such as submitting assignments, that kind of thing, then they would be considered attendance taking. But if they weren't, If they were merely logins, then they would not be attendance taking. We revised that language more recently to focus on synchronous sessions where attendance might be taken, or cases where the institution was using the attendance data for purposes of maintaining enrollment and potentially removing a student who was a non-attender. But in any event, this has been a very confusing area for institutions, and many institutions have told us over time that they didn't understand whether they were or were not subject to attendance taking requirements for this provision. So that's the broad argument for making this change for simplicity. But I do hear you, Scott, on your request for more data on specifics. As I mentioned with the asynchronous clock hour issue, it is sometimes difficult for the department to dig down to the level of very specifically which part of the RTT4 requirements were violated. We do have findings codes that allow us to get at broadly which ones are which, and we will try to dig down and see if we can get you some more examples of how this has gone awry in the past as well. But that is what I just described is the broad reason that we are trying to make this clearer. And we also believe, as I mentioned, that this will make calculations much more accurate in cases where schools were already obtaining much of this data through their distance education LMS, especially since in many cases, the assignments, et cetera, are being submitted directly to the institution and have to be submitted through that format in order for them to track the student's progress in a class. So I'll pause there and go back to other committee members.
Okay, thank you. Barmack?
Yes, I guess I'm a little concerned about the formalism of attendance taking. Mainly because to the extent that there are audit trails that satisfy the department's requirements, those audit trails are presumably more reliable. The recording of a data withdrawal is entirely and unilaterally within the power of the institution, and it would be nice if the idea is to create a reliable evidentiary basis for determination of the exact date of non-attendance in a course, to the extent that alternative, more reliable, real-time audit trails that satisfy the academic engagement requirement are available. I think those should be deemed very explicitly as the superseding evidence of dates of attendance. I'm just worried that institutions may have reasons to record dates of non-attendance that may be different than what the student believes, and I don't know what the remedy would be for the student to go back to the department to request greater investigation.
Thanks, Barmack. I guess I want to be sure I understand your point and the issue that you're focused on. Are you concerned primarily about what we were just discussing with Zach, where the school can use other records from courses that it's not taking attendance in or required its instructors to take attendance in to determine the student's withdrawal date?
I'm just concerned that the idea of creating a proxy in the form of a notational mandate on the schools gives the school unilateral power in some ways to put a date down when there are, and that may be the only remedy we have when there's nothing else there, right? In a face-to-face setting where the faculty actually takes formal attendance. That's all you got. But in cases where you have systems with audit trails that retain information about student participation, engagement with the faculty, with the course material, et cetera, I think those should trump some notational entry unilaterally by the school that claim a particular date of non-attendance. For what it's worth, I don't know what you can do with it, but it's sort of, I'm just suggesting that there are more reliable evidentiary bases for determining these dates than just what the school records and reports to the department.
Mm-hmm.
No, well, and Denise's hand is also up. I don't know if she wants to weigh in.
I'll let Denise go first.
So Iraq, in situations where our program reviewers, at least that's what I deal with, are going in and looking to determine whether the last date of attendance is accurate for the return calculations. They are looking in the LMS system, if that's what you're talking about, rather than, in fact, I've had cases where there might be the LMS system might be set up here and then it gets transferred, and we haven't accepted the transfer over where an individual is now putting in some kind of master attendance. So from the program review perspective, I don't know about the auditors. The department is looking back at what you're talking about, I think is more reliable right in the system to see where we can see academic engagement. So we are looking behind that as a policy in FSA.
Yeah, and I thank you, Denise. And I think, I think, Barmack, you're speaking to an issue that frankly has always been part of the return of Title IV process and a concern of the departments from the very beginning. Back before there was really distance ed used broadly, we were forced to rely on attendance records that instructors kept that may or may not have been accurate. And still to this day, if they're not required by the school to take attendance, we don't have a whole lot of ability to really dig in any further to see if the instructor was taking good attendance, if he was really monitoring who was there when. And the department's position for many years has been that we rely on the institution ultimately to make this call. That said, if we received a complaint from a student that asserted that the school had essentially established a date that was too early or too late, I guess it could be either way, for the student, and the student argued that they didn't submit something or that they did and the school didn't record it, we would still pursue that with the school, and as part of the complaint resolution process, we would take that all the way to the school to ask them to go into their records and evaluate it. But there is, I think, there's a certain level of accuracy the department just cannot get down to without the support of the institution. But we frankly believe that this will help us because it will turn institutions toward use of their LMS systems in cases where it's clear that they had to use that to track the student attendance. But I'm not sure how much further we could go to resolve the broader issue of cases where there is no particular requirement. We would certainly ask them to look at the best available data, and that's been our position, but there are cases where that may not be possible.
Thank you. Just to note that Erica Linden will step back in as primary. Robin.
Hi, thank you. I just want to thank the department for proposing this provision and say that we strongly support it because the legal aid folks, we've seen a lot of abuses in this area, and I'll just give one example. We had a client who enrolled online at the University of Phoenix, and she couldn't attend a single day. She couldn't even log on because she lacked the equipment necessary to do so, but the University of Phoenix never returned any Title IV funds, and she eventually, even though she thought she had withdrawn and told them that, she was disabled and eventually was having her Social Security disability income garnished to repay defaulted loans. And when we tried to get, through a FERPA request, tried to get student records of login attempts sort of to substantiate an unpaid refund discharge, we had a very difficult time getting those. So I say this is very, very helpful to students, and I would ask the department to consider a guidance or something clarifying that students should be able to access their login records when they do FERPA requests, that those kinds of records are included in student records available to students. But again, really appreciate this provision. Thanks.
All right. Erica.
Thank you. This may just be because I have a lot of gray hair and I don't remember from our January meeting, but it did occur to me in my notes that we referenced students, for example, in PhD programs who may, how was attendance to apply to a student in a PhD program who is away from the academic environment but working diligently on dissertation and things like that, where there might not be those touch points. And I just don't recall where we landed last time, and I don't see any notes here about that. So if that's something, Dave, you can clarify, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
This is a very good question. So Doctoral dissertations are an area that the department traditionally has handled a little bit differently than other kinds of coursework. I think there's an acknowledgement that although there typically is interaction and there is an expectation of regular interaction between students and their advisors, which we would interpret as instructors during these periods, coursework is not carried out in exactly the same way during dissertations. We did hear the concern from the group that the concept of distance education, may not apply in these cases. I think that right now the department's view is there's one of two things happening in an institution's dissertation coursework. Either the student is not actually interacting with their advisor instructor on a frequent basis, and or the institution is not recording that interaction, in which case the course might be a correspondence course rather than a distance education course, and this would not apply, but other requirements would apply. Or the institution is recording the interactions that the student has with their instructor or advisor, and the dates of those interactions, and in an effort to ensure that they're meeting the regular substantive interaction requirements for a distance education course. In that case, we would still apply this requirement here because there is an expectation that the school is recording those interactions.
Thank you. Jillian.
Yeah, I can put my hand down. My question was similar statement to Erica. I mean, I think just to reiterate the proposal I sent you guys that you didn't like, I think there are concerns functionally in terms of how doctoral programs, especially in sort of late stage dissertation, are handled here. And I should say, and I think, I mean, the department knows this, at Capella, we've been taking attendance since before it was a requirement for sure, because we have those LMS records that have tracked every action that a student is taking in a course. So I think in theory, functionally, I don't have concerns with the department sort of codifying what I have understood to be longstanding guidance from the department that if the institution has this data, they should be using it for RHT4 purposes anyway. So in general, I totally agree with this approach, but I do think it's challenging when we talk about some of these specific program, either types or elements within a program like doctoral programs. And I have not completed one, but I think some of these negotiators have. I'm guessing probably Jamie has, I'm sure Laura has, I think Scott's off camera, but I know he has a doctoral degree. I think they can all speak to how the dissertation phase is different in terms of what that interaction is between the student and the institution. And, just to be frank, like certainly institutions can build in low value academic attendance requirements in those programs to meet this requirement. But I think it disadvantages students ultimately because they're not going to feel like, or they're not going to readily know like, oh, I need to go in every 14 days and do this thing because of this department requirement. And so I guess I would just push back again and ask the department to consider the proposal that I sent, which is not asking for the department to not take this approach, but to really consider in the doctoral space. And I know I'm the only person in this whole group that cares about direct assessment programs, but it's very similar there, especially because the department is really scrutinizing the programs that get approved for direct assessment. You guys signed off on every element of the way that we get aid to students in those programs, including how we handle attendance. And so would just ask the department to think again carefully about those aspects with respect to this proposal.
Thank you. Joellen.
So I just want to say I'm at a school that also takes attendance, and I agree with everything Jillian just said. I don't have concerns, but I'm trying to think logistically how this is going to work for schools that do not, that they don't take attendance. So my question is, Dave, for schools that don't take attendance, but they have online programs that have that online interaction with the student and record that information, if the student were to withdraw officially on one date, are you saying this financial administrator has to go back to look at those online recorded records? Can they use that official withdrawal date, or now they have to go back and find those records of when the student last interacted online with their whatever process they're using at the school?
Great question.
Can you clarify that for me?
Yeah. The answer is that if If the student is enrolled entirely in distance education courses, again, under this provision, under this proposal, if they were enrolled entirely in distance education courses or a combination of distance education courses and other attendance taking courses, the institution would be required to go back to actual records to determine the student's withdrawal date. You couldn't simply use the official withdrawal date because, as you know, students often attend, days after the official withdrawal date, days prior to the official withdrawal date. For attendance taking programs, the school always has to use the last date of attendance as they define in their, as they determine from their records.
Okay. Are there any more discussion on this section before we go to a temperature check? Okay, hearing none, I think we are ready for temperature check on 668.22B3 Romanet I-D. We can see thumbs on that. It looks like we do have one thumb down. Jillian, did you want to add anything that you haven't already talked about? Okay. Thank you. We have marked that. And we are ready, Dave, to go on to our next section.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for the very interesting discussion. I think the department does have a few things to think about on that provision. Vanessa, I think we can go on to the next one. And that takes us down to 668.22F. This is the provision that I thought I was talking about earlier, relating to clock hour programs and students who have reached the second or subsequent payment period in those programs before withdrawing. So if you can scroll down just for a moment here. In the case of a program that is measured in clock hours, by dividing the total number of clock hours in the payment period of enrollment into the clock hours scheduled to be completed. And we have added, since the student began attendance in the payment period or period of enrollment as of the student's withdrawal date. And again, I'll go back to, hopefully people will remember this rather complicated explanation for why we're doing this. There are currently two different ways, legitimate ways for schools to interpret the existing regulatory language. And that is to simply add up the scheduled hours without consideration for when the student actually reached the next payment period. We are specifying here that scheduled hours in a payment period don't begin counting until the payment period actually begins, which is to say the day that the student successfully completes all of the hours in the prior payment period. I'll pause there for any discussion on this one.
Any comments or discussion? Okay. Seeing none, I feel that we are ready for temperature check on section 668.22F1 Romanet 2A. We can see thumbs on this section. It looks like we have everything marked. No thumbs down. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Go on to our next section.
All right, and then the last item here, this was a change to the way that the department determines when the days in a module are included in the denominator of the Return of Title IV funds calculation. We previously discussed that the current process we have heard from institutions is somewhat complicated. It involves additional administrative steps to determine whether there is an R2T4 freeze date that a school uses to determine when to freeze the days that they would include in the denominator, as well as, if the school is not using that, a determination of at the end of the period what the student was scheduled to attend throughout the period. We believe this proposal will substantially simplify that process by simply saying that the days in the module are included in the denominator of the calculation only when the student begins attendance in the module. And because schools generally do identify attendance in a module at least once for Pell Grant purposes and or general purposes at least once during the payment period, most institutions are already collecting this information and would be able to do this without a substantial amount of additional burden. I will pause there and ask if there's any additional discussion on this one.
Okay. If there is no additional discussion, we'll do our final temperature check for R2T4. That's 668.22. Is that I9? I or L, I believe it's I. I9. The show of thumbs. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much. And thank you all so much for your discussion today. An excellent use of the chat box as well. Our next topic is going to be accreditation, which we can roll right into. Okay. Denise.
I just wanted to let everybody know I'm going to be stepping back, and my colleague Donna Mangold will be now at the table, or at the table as we call it. And in case there's anybody wondering, Dave and I have been getting off camera when there's a vote so that the facilitators can see only the voting members. So if anybody out there was wondering why we keep getting off, that's why.
Thank you. And thank you so much. Oh, David.
And I was just going to say the same thing. I will be stepping back and letting my colleagues from the accreditation group come to the table. Thanks, everybody, for the great discussion today.
Thank you. Coming to the table on behalf of the department to lead us is Herman Bounds. Good morning, Herman. And at this point, I will also turn it over to our FMCS facilitator, Cindy Jeffries. I will take a step back and Cindy will take over as facilitator. I thought I saw another hand. Did I not? No. Okay.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you. Take it over, Cindy.
I just want to mention that Greg Martin will, as the ed negotiator, and Herman Bounds will be both at the table for the accreditation portion that we're about to embark on. Seeing no hands before we get started, Jamie? You're on mute, Jamie.
Thanks everyone for pointing out my signal problems. I have switched to 3 new forms of technology, let us hope. Second, I would like to ask for a caucus at this point as we, before we launch into this topic. And I would like to invite the state negotiators and all of the institutional representatives. To my eye, but I don't have that list open in front of me, that includes the representatives from the HBCUs, MSI and tribal colleges, 2- and 4-year institutions, proprietary institutions, business officers, and financial aid administrators. If there's anyone representing institutions and I have forgotten that category, our purpose in doing this is we would like to understand the effects of some of the provisions that we're going to be discussing. So that we can facilitate the conversation and anticipate where there are some things that might impinge on institutional considerations so that we can be aware of them and well prepared for the conversation that we will all have together. I don't want it to seem like I think it's important that we all hear all perspectives, but we would like to be informed by talking to these particular entities if they are willing to join a caucus. I'm thinking we wondered 25 minutes, 30 if you want to round it.
Yeah, that'd work fine. Let's do this. I do know that you asked if you had missed anyone from institutions. I think private nonprofit was inadvertently not mentioned. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Erica? Okay.
Sorry, I meant, no, I just, when I was thinking two and four, I just-
Yeah, well, we're gonna ask everybody to raise their hand here that's willing to participate in a minute. Laura?
Jamie, you didn't mention all of the accreditors either, so I just wanted to make sure you mean all of the accreditors.
Of course, when I did that, I actually was speaking on behalf of Laura and Michael as well, including the caucus.
Okay.
I haven't done that step before.
So, Brady, you want to assist here, and I think we'll have to have everyone turn on their camera so that we can see hands. And all right, so show us your hands if you are participating in this caucus so that we can do a call out for the record. I'll give it a minute here because it keeps jumping around. So I'm showing at this moment Scott Dolan, David Cohen, Jillian Klein, Alyssa Dobson, Laura Racer King, Joellen Price, Amy Ackerson, Jason Lorgan, Erica Linden, Dom Chase. Let me know if I'm going too fast, Brady. Joe Blondin, Zach Goodman, Jamie Studley, Michael McComas, D'Angelo Sands, DC, Joe Weglars, Michael Ciosi. Switch pages here. All right, did I miss anyone?
Can I just quickly ask for clarity? I wasn't sure if at the top you mentioned states as well, or if I just misheard you, but I just wanted to clarify.
I was inviting the state regulators.
Got it. Okay. It cut out on my end, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I think we did miss John Ware as well, but I'll
Right.
Okay.
All right. John will send you an invite.
Thank you. Okay, so that is who will be caucusing. I show it as 11:06. Let's do a check-in. Jamie will check in with you about 11:35 and see how you're progressing. David, do you have your hand up with a question or just still from? Okay, great, thanks.
I think we should be good.
Okay.
Let me know if anyone who was named did not get an invite. There's a bunch of folks, so I might have missed someone, but I think we are okay.
Okay. So with that, we can pause the live stream. Hey, welcome back, everyone. The caucus parties have returned. This time I'm going to ask Jamie, who called the caucus, if they have anything they would like to report out on.
You know, I thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you everybody for the indulgence of the time. I think that the comments that we had were helpful in us reviewing some of the specific provisions, and that the interchange in the caucus would be most helpful if people just discuss their viewpoints as we go through provisions that have some interactive effect between accreditors and institutions. So nothing to report except a friendly conversation that we think might be helpful in exploring some of the topics that we'll be coming to.
Well, good. Thank you for that, Jamie. Glad you were able to make good use of the caucus time. With that being said, are there any additional comments before we start? Barmack?
Yes, given the time, I would like to request a caucus with all of the committee members that were excluded from the previous caucus. They can just raise their hands maybe to self-identify for your convenience. And hopefully we can get it done before lunch so that the proceedings can start immediately after lunch.
Okay. So Brady, I'm calling on your assistance. That would be Barmack, Carolyn, Robin, Jesse Morales, Diana Hooley, Maheen Sanchez, Sophie Lang. Am I missing anyone?
Yes, the department.
Oh, you went to department. Okay. Greg?
They are negotiators.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so you would like Greg and Herman, and would you like Donna in there as well?
Absolutely, of course.
Okay, anyone else from the department besides those three?
Anybody that the department chooses to bring is obviously the department is.
Yeah. Greg, did you want anyone else from the department besides the three of you?
I will leave that up to our supervisor Antoinette Flores as to whether she wants to have anybody else, and I don't know yet because I haven't communicated with her just yet, but she'll be with me about anybody else she wanted to include from the department. I mean, right now it would be Donna, Herman, and me, and then if Antoinette chooses to add somebody, I'll let you know who that would
Okay, sounds good. So we can, it is 11:45. Let's plan on while doing this caucus, we will incorporate the lunch break during that, and we will resume back here at 1 o'clock to start in with the accreditation discussion. Okay, so with that, if we pause the live stream and move people into the caucus room, I'd appreciate it.
Yep, you all should be getting invites to room 6 right now.